Hello, everyone, and happy November to all my authors, historians, all of my fans around the world. And welcome to the November lineup here on Tales from the Wandering Scribe. I'm your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And today we have a very special guest on the show, making her official debut here on the channel. Apologies, viewers. I'm just pulling up the bio. My guest was born and raised in Long Island, New York City, and currently resides in Texas. After a major plot twist where she lost her full-time job for almost a decade in a mass layoff, her friends urged her to pursue her dream of writing a book of her own, and thus an author was born. My guest enjoys spending time with her husband, children, two cats, and goofball of a dog, or attending pop punk shows. She has an MA in English literature from SUNY New Paltz and is proud, aka relieved, to use her degree for more than just a punchline finally. So without further ado, let's give a huge round of applause to today's guest and headliner for the November lineup, author Stacey LP. Stacey, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. So before we dive into your background of being an author, is there anything else you'd like to share with the viewers and listeners? Anything that was not mentioned in the bio?
Yeah, so I have been living in Texas for 3 years. I have been working in tech for the last decade, and I've always wanted to do something with my English lit degree, but I had no idea what that something was. So when I was let go in a mass layoff, my friends were like, Stacey, now's your time. So I started writing my book, and now it's coming out November 15th.
Awesome. Awesome. And as a little teaser for our viewers and listeners, what can you give us as a little anticipation for your upcoming debut novel?
So, my upcoming debut novel is called Afterglow Rising from the Ashes. It's going to be book one of the Afterglow Rising trilogy. And it's a dystopian post apocalyptic sci fi story set in the aftermath of an alien invasion. And
Ooh.
it takes place in Austin, Texas. So, it follows a group of survivors as they're trying to figure out okay, so the aliens left, what now?
Ooh, I like that. That actually kind of reminds me of another post-apocalyptic dystopian sci-fi story by my friend Aaron, who kind of wrote that these aliens are just like jellyfish and they just destroy Earth because they can hear sound. Think of like a quiet place, but they're like jellyfish and they just, eat everything. They're not like evil, they're not malicious. They're just animals that just came to Earth looking
And are
for a new place and just consumed everything. And so that's what I'm kind of getting from what you told me of your book. Now that is really, really exciting. So now let's actually dive into the creativity behind that. Let's actually go back in time. So, Stacey, can you tell us what was your childhood like growing up? Were you always a creative person, or did that come about later in life?
Yeah, so I've always been really into reading. When I was a kid, actually, my parents would punish me by taking away my books, mainly because I would be reading past my bedtime. So I've always loved literature, clearly, and also storytelling. I was never really a confrontational type of person. So when I was a younger kid and someone would be mean to me, instead of, starting a fight over it or like getting into an argument, I would start telling a story. And it's led to some really interesting situations. I learned as I got older that maybe there are better ways of handling things, but also I'm good at storytelling.
Awesome. So now, what would you say was your aha moment when you realized that you can take your passion for storytelling and go beyond being a hobbyist and actually build your brand as an author?
Yeah, so it definitely started after I was laid off because I was in this place where I'm like, okay, I've built this career for the last decade. Now what? And I was in a group chat with a bunch of my friends. We talk about books all the time. And we started talking about the types of books that we wanted to see that we just hadn't seen yet. And from that conversation, a lot of the foundation for Afterglow started coming about. And they're like, Stacey, you should write it. And I was like, you know what? I have the time. So that's when I started writing my book, Afterglow. And now here we are.
Awesome. So now that kind of leads into the next set of questions, which is now the creation of Afterglow. So let's actually start at the very beginning. So after you said you talked with your friends and they encouraged you to pursue your dream and to bring this book to life, when you finally sat down at your computer, started writing out the draft or the outline, what were the initial goals you had, not just for yourself, but
Mhm.
also for your future readers?
Yeah. So as far as goals for myself goes, I kind of went into this like, let's see what happens. I didn't really have any expectations about what I was going to do with my book, whether I was even going to finish it. I was just like, you know what? Let's see how far we could take this thing. So I started doing a lot of research on how to publish and traditionally publish books versus self publication.
Mm,
And I started joining a lot of different communities just to kind of learn from other authors out there. And the more I learned, the more fascinated I got. And I realized like this is really something I want to immerse myself in. So I guess now my goal is absolutely finishing the trilogy, but similar to when I started, I want to see how far I can take this thing. I love writing. If I could, I would do this full time. So why not see what happens?
I hear you. I think that's what every author's goal is when they begin. Like, how far can I take this? And talking about passion, drive, and all those other factors we'll touch in later in the interview. So now let's actually jump forward ahead. So after you finish constructing the draft and working with an editor, finding a cover artist, did you do any beta readers or ARC readers for your story? And can you tell us about that experience? Were they positive, negative, or mixed?
Yeah. So I did a couple rounds of alpha and beta readers because like I said, this is my first time going through the process. I've written for myself, I've written academically, I've written for fun, but I've never really written for an audience. So I
Hmm.
wanted to make sure that the way I'm going about it is something that's going to be received well by anyone reading it, whether they are a fan of science fiction or coming from another genre, or they're just curious to see what is this thing all about. So my group of friends actually were my alpha readers at first, giving me feedback on the general feel of the story, whether it was interesting. Once I finished my first draft, I had a group of beta readers that read the whole thing and gave me very specific comments about how did they feel when they were reading the story, what was their impression of the characters, were there any moments that felt like it was slow or any moments that were too fast. And I was really excited to see that the most common response that I got after people submitted their feedback was, I need more.
That's good. That's probably the best one when people say, I want more, and they furiously message you saying, when's the next book? When's the next part? That's when you know you have like a good fan base that is really dedicated to the story.
Yeah, and I'm still getting feedback from ARC readers because I just sent out my advanced review copies a couple of weeks ago. So I'm starting to see reviews trickle in, and I'm starting to get those live text reactions through Instagram from people who are reading it, being like, "Oh my God, Stacey, what are you doing to me?" But
Awesome.
I'm enjoying it, which is super fun.
And would you also say that that kind of in a way validated your goals with Afterglow that you set out from the beginning?
Definitely. Yeah. Because I think, you know, when we think about why we write, there is that personal motivation, but there is the audience too that you have in
Hmm.
mind. Because part of the reason why we're publishing is we want to put our words out there. We want to make an impact.
Yes.
And whether that impact is positive or negative, the reader's walking away with something because of the words you wrote. So I think, you know, no matter what the feedback is, if the reader walks away feeling a certain way, especially if that feeling is, you know, strong, whether they strongly
Yes.
like it or strongly dislike it, you know, I think that is absolutely accomplishing any goals that I would set out to do as a reader, author, and reader.
You know, definitely. I 100% agree, Stacey, because you know what? It's nice when you have like that feedback from your fans, from readers who are really invested in your story. And I also find it's also really cool when people who read outside of their genre give the most feedback, the most honest feedback. And it's it's really kind of very humbling, but also it builds up the confidence for us authors, which then leads into this first reflective question, which I'm eager to hear your thoughts on, which is this. So, as I'm sure you know, being an author is not easy. It's not cheap. It's not a get rich quick scheme. It's years and years of just making the first draft and then from there editing it, finding a cover artist, which also takes money if you're going the independent route. It's balancing your finances, it's marketing, it's all of that. Because ultimately, just as you said, Stacey, we all want to showcase our work to our audience. And
Yeah.
that leads into a lot of great things, but also a lot of anxiety because we are first time authors when we begin, and that anxiety builds up into us. And when we present our world, especially now in the digital age where everybody can have access to our books, which it's exciting, but also terrifying because imposter syndrome now for indie authors is really, really huge because that is like probably the big deal breaker for a lot of authors. And I'm
Yeah.
curious, Stacey, when you began this journey of yours, and now realizing in a few weeks that your book will be out to the masses, did you have that sense of anxiety and imposter syndrome? And if so or not, what has disciplined you to not only write and publish your upcoming debut novel, but you also plan a trilogy for this series?
Yeah. So absolutely feeling the imposter syndrome. I think, like you said, anytime you're doing something for the first time, it's a learning process. And especially when you do go the self publishing indie author route, you know, you're doing a lot of the work yourself. And it's very easy to feel like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just figuring this out as I go. Like, what right do I have to make this thing happen? But my philosophy has always been to kind of like step back and say, all right, well, what's the worst that can happen? And when I think about what's the worst that can happen, I'm like, people don't like what I write. Okay. I've
Mhm.
gotten criticism before. I in my writing classes in college, like I was used to having my writing picked apart and it just made me a better author.
Right.
And so I kind of look at it as, can I live with that worst case scenario? And I was like, you know what? Yeah. So like, why don't we see what happens? Because that's the worst case scenario I can think of, and I can deal with it. Then might as well just keep going.
Definitely,
So,
100%. And you know,
yeah.
you're absolutely right. Whenever we begin something for the first time, there is that sense of anxiety, that hesitancy. But over time, as we'll talk on later in the interview, we only get better as time goes on and we learn new things, which now leads perfectly into the business side of the interview, the business portion of being an author, which is arguably probably now my favorite part of doing interviews because I'm really interested to hear my guests' response to these questions. So the first one, which is also like a little icebreaker, is, what journey did they decide to go on for their author route? So for you, it seems that you went down the independent journey for your debut novel. However, did you play with the idea of potentially going the traditional route, writing query letters, researching publication houses? And if so, can you tell us about your experience and what you learned from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am going the independently published route. I actually started an LLC to seriously invest in this as a business because, like you said, like a lot of time, a lot of funds go into it. So I think it does pay to take it seriously and treat it as a business. So in addition to that, when I first started researching everything, I did look into traditional publishing. And I do think that there is a lot of benefit to going that route. I think working with especially larger publication houses, they help a lot with a lot of the process that can be more time consuming, or processes that authors don't necessarily want to spend as much time doing or
Yes.
have to when they go the indie route. I would like to explore traditional publishing eventually. I have a couple ideas for books that I would want to try and query and see again, how far can I take this thing? So I really like to do things for the experience of it. So even though I am going the independently publishing route this time, I absolutely want to explore traditional publishing and see like what can I do with this in the future.
Definitely. And also, it's a little side question. I also want to hear your thoughts on this. I had a guest on the show, I want to say last month, who is a hybrid author, and he talked about his experiences of going the hybrid route. And from what he's told me, there seems to be this sort of like disconnect for hybrid authors. They're not solely traditional, but they're not totally indie, and they're kind of like
Yeah.
in this middle ground. And from his opinion and from his perspective, there seems to be this disconnect within the community, which we will talk about later when it comes to like networking. But I'm just wondering, when you were doing your research, did topics of like hybridization come up, or like to be wary of hybridization appear in your research? And what are sort of your thoughts on this new avenue for authors who can go the hybrid route?
Yeah, so I definitely came across those scenarios when I was looking at different forums and just seeing what published authors have had to say about their experiences. I think there's also kind of two forms of hybrid publishing that I have found, where you have a traditional publisher that you're signed to, and then you also publish under your own publishing company independently.
Mm.
And I think there are benefits to that, where you're working with like a fully traditional publisher, and then you're also fully managing your self-publishing separately, because self-publishing does come with a lot more freedom. You have
Yes.
control over the entire process, and if you like to have that control like I do, definitely it fits a lot of that need and gives you
Mhm.
that also sense of satisfaction at the end, like I did this, I made it happen.
Right.
Whereas with traditional publishers, when you go the fully traditional route, they do have the editing, cover design, they have a whole team that's going to be working with the author, but it's also a business too. And the
Yes.
publisher has to do what's going to be best for the publisher's business.
Hmm.
Understand that and expect that going into it. Otherwise, you're not going to have a great experience. I know there are also some, I've been seeing hybrid publishers come up where they'll handle certain parts of publishing, where they'll handle certain parts and then the author will handle certain parts, but there still is a cost that the author has to
Right.
pay. And that's always something that I've kind of been a little wary of. Um,
Hmm.
I think that when you get into that kind of split role, it gets a little bit blurry as to, who's going to be responsible for what, how much of the book are they going to own the rights to. So
Mm,
that I would say, like, I'm sure there are a ton of hybrid companies out there that have good intentions, but I think it really is important to fully understand what exactly you're getting into when you work with any company.
right. And also, just like, business, they have to be mindful of who their audience is, because they're taking a product and
Mhm.
they're sharing it with the masses. So they have to really consider who their audience is. And especially for independent authors, we have to really do all that research on our own. We don't have a team. We're on our own. So we have to figure
Oh,
out who the target audience is. So let's actually talk about that, Stacey. So when you finally got your book to the point that you wanted to be, and you were figuring out, the marketing of how to promote this book, did you have a good idea of who your audience is? And as an add-on to that question,
yeah.
how necessary is the audience for the author to take into consideration? And the reason I bring this up is, for us, the authors, we're the initial target audience because we know the story better than anyone else. We enjoy it. But for other people, we have to consider them if we're going to publish.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's multiple parts to this too, because especially with social media being a
Mm-hmm.
marketing tool, you not only have people who are interested in the book, but also people who are interested in you as a brand. So I think with what I've been noticing as I've kind of built up my network and connected with readers and connected with other authors, um, I do tend to be a little bit different than some of the other genres out there. And what I mean by that is, I am in the science fiction genre for this trilogy, but there's also a lot of influence from the books that I like to read. Like, I love
Yes.
fantasy. I love romance novels. They're great. Anyone, it's still literature. Um, um, but I think that, and postmodernism too, I studied postmodernism when I was in school, and a lot of the different, tools and stylistic elements I do incorporate into my writing. So there's a lot of crossover where,
Yes.
yes, the genre is science fiction, but if you like this style of writing, if you like this style of world building, if you like these stylistic elements, I think that readers can still get into my story. And that's what I found. Because since my network is so diverse, I have people who have read Afterglow for the ARC copies, and they're like, this is completely out of my usual genre, and I did not know what to expect, and I had a great time, which is like really cool because, when you can appeal to an audience that is outside of what you would expect, like, that's such a huge win. And it's so cool to like be able to broaden not only your horizons, but take readers into a realm that maybe they wouldn't have discovered otherwise.
Yes, definitely. And actually brought up something which is, important, which is, the books that, inspired us and helped mold our voice. Because originally, when I started this interview, or rather these interviews back 2 years ago, I had a question for all my guests, which was, who were the authors or books that inspired your writing? And I
Yeah.
had a guest this year who changed that and actually gave me a new question, which I now like asking my guests, which is this. Well, it's actually not more of like a question, but it's more of like a response to a discussion, which is, for us authors, at the end of the day, we're trying to get our voice out. We're trying to showcase our work. But just as you said, Stacey, we can showcase, the people that inspired us, who gave us the inspiration, but we don't want to replicate or imitate their styles of writing, how they approach characters, or so forth. Because I'm sure you have seen books that have had the tagline, so and so meets so and so. And from a reader's perspective, that gets them interested. Even if they've never read either of those two authors at all, but have heard of them from word of mouth, they can just jump right into story and expect certain things. But from an author, we don't like to be pigeonholed into one category. Yes, there may be a category that we feel the most comfortable in when it comes to our writing, but we can showcase our other styles of writing in other genres.
Yeah.
And that is ultimately, a really good thing because it shows that we're very versatile. So pretty much he gave me this question, how do we balance the two where we want to show reverence and respect to the works that helped mold us and give us our voice, but we also want to show our individuality to our readers so that way when they pick up our books, they know what to expect when they say, oh, this is a book by Stacey LP. I now know what to expect when she comes up with the next book.
Yeah, I love that question. I think it's a really important question to ask too, because anytime you read something, you're going to take a piece of that with you, especially as book lovers,
Yes.
like part of that book will always kind of like live inside of you for the rest of your life. At least that's the way it is for me. So I do think that I have picked up different things from different authors that I have read. Like Jonathan Safran Foer has always been a huge influence on my writing style. I love the disjointedness. I love the non-linear timelines. I love having multiple narrators and unreliable narrators. And I also love the world building that I see in fantasy. Like
Hmm.
one of my favorite novels is, or actually series, I should say, is Spark of the Everflame, the Kindred's Curse saga by Penn. Phenomenal, by the way. But the way that Penn Cole kind of builds this world and asks questions of, okay, so you have this person who's the antagonist, but are they the villain? And
Mm.
are the supposed heroes and they've done these terrible things, but there's a reason why they did them. And do we still think that they're the heroes? Like those questions of morality and, taking it a little step further, something that I've explored in my book is, what does it mean to be human in a world where humanity has been completely destroyed? So I think that when I look at my writing style and how I go about creating these stories, it always starts with a question. And
Right.
where that question comes from, whether it's, stemming from something that I've read in the past, or whether it's something that I'm just sitting down and letting my mind spiral and we see where it goes. I think when you do actually sit down to write, there are influences that will make it their way into your writing. And I think it's important to be able to recognize where that influence is coming from and also have that idea of what you want your voice to sound like. Like, what's something that sets you apart where as you're writing this story, people are like, oh, yeah, like that's Stacey's writing style.
Hmm.
I've thought a lot about that as I've been writing Afterglow because again, like this is my first novel and of course my husband teases me. He's like, of course you would decide to write a book and you'd make it a trilogy because I have to do the most. So yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of explore the different parts of that and really think about how that impacts my writing process and what's going into the final product too.
Definitely. And another thing to take into consideration is also the readership, which, now looking
Mhm.
back, the readership is very important. And the reason I bring that up, viewers and listeners, especially if this is your first time coming onto the show, readers are a little bit different from the target audience. Yes,
Yeah.
you want to target the audience that you're going for in your genre, but at the end of the day, it's your readership. And that's when it comes to really fine tuning your book, when it comes down to the bare bones language. Is
Mhm.
it new adult? Is it adult? Is it YA? Because let's be honest, there are certain books that are published that upon reading them, they could have used a second revision to fine tune their style of writing, but also their language to their target audience. And I've seen a lot of that and heard most of that from the romance fantasy genre, which that is a whole discussion in and of itself. But for you, Stacey, when you again were marketing this book and getting it to where you wanted, do you have a good idea of sort of like where it fits in the age group for your audience? And was that a challenge?
Yeah, so I would definitely consider it in the adult range, 18 plus. There are adult themes that younger audiences may not be able to fully relate to, or they just it may not be age appropriate. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that is, I very intentionally wanted to have characters that were in their 30s as the main characters. And I think generationally, when we're looking at, a lot of the popular books right now, it is new adult. It is focused on people who are in their early 20s. And the motivations of the characters are so different compared to an older main character who has been through
Yes.
more experiences. I think there's absolutely a shift once you hit past 25 and your brain fully develops. And you have less, you have to worry less about impulse control and have more time to reflect on things. But that also influences, how do the characters go about the actions and how did they approach conflict in the book? And I think having characters in their 30s, I didn't want to rely on the tropes of like miscommunication or the more emotional reactions that people have, but I wanted to focus more,
Mm.
since they're a little bit older, like maybe they have more emotional intelligence and they're able to reflect before they react. And how does that tie into the conflict and move the story forward and
Right.
still interesting? Because you don't want to have characters who have all the answers. So
Right.
what's going to come between them and the solution? So that's kind of how I approached the like age range as far as my book goes. But I do think still, like, even though I would consider it adult and I would say like people who are in their 30s would appreciate that, I do think that people in their 20s or older generations would also have a good time. I do have a pretty wide age range of characters in my books too. So there's that.
Yes, that is true. And I actually had a previous guest on the show, uh, Ryan Fitzpatrick, who said that his book, it targeted all like a whole wide range of audience from like uh kids as young as probably like middle school to like older adults. And another one, which is actually really surprising, and this goes into readership, not so much as a book, but it's actually a graphic novel called Nuclear Power by Fan-Based Press. Go and check out that interview, everyone. It's actually my first double interview. But the reason I bring that up is nuclear power is an alternate history world where the Cuban Missile Crisis ends in a nuclear holocaust and fallout in the United States, resulting in the original 13 colonies becoming the new America called the American Union. And it's a lot of, mutants, government espionage. Pretty much, as the authors told me, America becomes the Cuba of that reality. And they initially were trying to get, people of, our age bracket who like comics, movies, and so forth. But surprisingly, a majority of their audience came from people that grew up during the height of the Cold War, and even specifically the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that was a huge shocker to them. And that's probably one of the best things about being an author is the uncertainty, the surprises in that regard. That can really, really make you think, oh, okay, now I found something new. Now I have an audience that I never really considered.
Yeah, yeah. And I think too, when you're like going back to like beta readers and sending out ARC copies, I think that's why it's so important that when you are looking for that early readership base, that you do try and extend a net that is diverse.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think it is important that as authors we consider that our audience is going to be, it could be anyone. And do your characters speak to more than just one classification of person, like more than
Right.
one range, more than one gender, like more than one sexuality, like race is a huge like factor too. And I think diversity in books, especially in like science fiction and fantasy, is so important for that reason. Because
Yes.
we're creating these new worlds, like let's do it the right way. If the worlds can be anything we want, let's make it diverse and make it
Yes.
so anyone who's reading your book could see themselves in the characters.
Definitely, 100%. And that actually, with everything that we talked about, leads into probably the biggest question that I love to ask my guests because it has a lot of gravitas and weight. So I'm gonna lay some context for this one, Stacey. So, we talked about building an audience. We talked about building our brand. We talked about growing as authors, and by talking, for me, talking with various authors for almost 2 years now, I've come to realize that there's two paths for us authors: those who want to be authors and those who want to be known as authors, which are two very different things. To be an author is an individual dedicated to storytelling, honing their craft, and not solely motivated by money, but let's be honest, it doesn't hurt getting capital every now and then. And the other side, to be known as an author, is an individual dedicated to marketing, showcasing their book on various platforms, social media posts, anything to get their name out there. Now, both paths have their own hurdles, their own trials and tribulations. And whenever I ask this question to my guests, they always say the same thing. Generally speaking, for first time authors who really get into this business, and they want to go down the second path to be known as an author, that does lead to unrealistic long-term goals because, for first time authors, getting your name up there really quick is not generally going to happen because at the end of the day, at that stage, there's no guarantee your first book is going to be the start of your legacy. There are exceptions to that rule, of course, just in any business. I've met many authors whose first book launched them to award-winning status. That is not an easy feat to do. That is a achievement in and of itself. But generally speaking, you have this roller coaster of highs and lows for first-time authors, and that ultimately deflates their passion. And now they're just writing just to join the trends, not because they're really passionate about it. So for you, Stacey, what are your thoughts on this discussion that, in this industry, it is kind of true. There is no guarantee your first book is going to guarantee your legacy or the start of your legacy as an author, but it should not stop you from honing your craft if you're truly passionate about this.
Yeah, it's such an important question because it ties back into motivation. What's your
Mhm.
why? Why are you doing this? Why are you pursuing it? What are your expectations? What are you looking to get out of it? Like with anything else that you do in life, like it's important to have a solid idea of what your expectations are and how would you feel if those expectations aren't met. So when I think about, what my goals are, what my long-term goals are, what I want, like it would be great to make this my like, full-time job, full career. Realistically, I know that that is a very difficult to do. But I think that, you know, there's a lot of work that goes into kind of discovering all of the steps that go into it and the different routes that you can go, even when it comes to like social media marketing. And
Mhm.
that if you want to make this a legitimate career and you want to build up your readership and you want to get to that level, it's going to take a lot of time and dedication, and you're going to eventually have to build a team. So
Yes.
about being someone who's in charge of other people representing your work. Handle. Do you like how does your social battery play out when
Right.
you're at conferences or at like work? I do a lot of workshops and webinars that I like to go to because again, like you do have to invest in your craft. I think it's very important to not just expand your horizons, but also look at your own skills and continue building on them. And one thing that I kept seeing is like to make money off of writing, you have to keep writing.
Yes.
And I think when you get caught up in that, can be it can sometimes, deflate your passion for it. So I think that it has to be something that whether you make money or not, you're invested. Like you want this. And that's kind of how I've always felt. I'm like, I've always wanted to write books. I've always wanted to put my writing out there and acknowledging and being okay with the fact that I may not benefit financially from this, probably ever, but I'm having a really fun time doing it.
Right.
When it's not fun, that's when I'm not going to do it anymore. But the whole process has been so interesting because there are so many pieces to publishing as an independent author that I had no idea I would have to become involved in before this process even started. So I think you really just have to understand what your expectations are and adjust accordingly and be okay if your ultimate goal has to shift a little bit.
Definitely. And to, cap that off before we get to the final two questions, grit transforms into talent because we only get better as time goes on. Because, as we talked about, your first book may not guarantee the start of your legacy. That's okay. It just gets your foot in the door because it may be your 7th, maybe your 15th, maybe even your 20th book that really gets your name out there. And when that does happen, you can tell your fans and readers who have been with you from the beginning, hey, if you enjoyed this book, check out my other ones because boom, you got yourself a new fan base. You got new readers, which combines with your old readers, and you've now reached your I made it moment. And this now leads into the last two questions where it comes down to, for networking and building our brands as authors. So for this is a two-part question, Stacey. So besides, of course, friends and family, are there any people that you like to give shout outs to who have helped you grow your brand as an author, who helped you understand the business a little bit better? And then finally, as the tail end for the interview, with everything you have learned thus far about the business, what is your word of wisdom to other authors who want to get into this industry for themselves?
Yeah, so absolutely. There's so many authors that I could shout out for, kind of introducing me to their processes and helping me along on this journey. But I've made some really good friends through social media platforms and just by reaching out to other authors and being like, hey, so you mentioned this, like, how did you do that? Or joining someone else's ARC team or joining someone else's
Right.
your beta team, like being involved in other authors' processes can teach you a lot about how to approach it when you're ready to go that route. And so I definitely have to give a shout out to Lauren Lee. Her second book, Burn, actually just came out on October 31st. So
Ooh, okay.
check it out. It's great. And Chris Walters, he's another author who has published multiple books at this point, and they're also wonderful. But I've kind of dubbed them my unofficial mentors, aka be sliding into their DMs, asking them questions. They talk me through all the spirals. And they've also been really great sources of feedback for my writing and how I'm going about the process. And I think it really is so important to have a network like that. And not just more experienced authors, but authors who are going through like at that same stage you are. So there's another author, R.A. Hunter. She has the same debut release date as me for Herbert. Many Mistakes of Amy Love, which I cannot tell you how much I love this book. It's a sapphic romance and it's wonderful. It will rip your heart out, but you will also love it. I promise. And Amanda Markwart, who has a book coming out. Her debut novel is also coming out November 15th, When Sparks Fly. It's a cute little small town romance, but there's also a lot of like action.
Ooh, okay.
But those two groups, I've really leaned on them throughout this process because with Amanda and Hunter, we're kind of in that same spot trying to figure everything out. And we're like, hey, like, I'm not sure what I'm doing. Do you know what you're doing? And to hear someone else be like, yeah, I don't know, but let's see what happens. You know, it helps to not feel so alone. And then having your more experienced author friends to lean on and say, hey, what did you do when you did this? And to have some direction, like, it helps so much. And I think the indie author community in general has just been so warm and welcoming. I've reached out to so many different authors just
Same
since
here.
joining the community, and it's wild. Like, I've never had a negative experience. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've loved doing this even more, is just because of the community that exists out there is so supportive, and you can learn so much from your peers. And I think that is my advice to anyone who is interested in pursuing, especially independent publishing, is, you know, get involved with the author community. Like, slide into those DMs, to join someone's ARC team, join a street team, subscribe to all the newsletters. And don't be afraid to reach out to someone and say, hey, I saw you did this. This is so cool. How did you make that happen? Because the more you build out your network, I think you then also become someone that those people lean on. And I think over time, you know, the best thing you can do is be genuine in that support. So when you are talking to someone and you're complimenting them, like, make a real compliment, like, believe it. When you're reaching out to be friends with someone, like, make sure that that is your, like, your intention is to become that person's friends, like, be a real person, and people will see that. And I think that's what makes people want to support you as well, is when they see, wow, like, this is a real person, like, they're genuine, like, they actually care, they're enthusiastic
Right.
about my success, and that makes them want to invest in you. And, like, that does sound like it's a strategic move, but I think it's just, you know, it's just what being a good supporter is about.
Definitely. Absolutely 100%. And actually, probably the most interesting answer to this question. So, thank you, Stacey, for your insight. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another author interview here on the channel. Want to give a huge thank you to Stacey for coming on the show and being our first guest for the month of November. Now, Stacey, where can people interact with you on social media, and where can people go to pre-order your book before it releases in a few weeks?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, Threads, and TikTok at author Stacey LP, and that's Stacey. Don't forget the E. And you can also find me on Goodreads and Amazon under Stacey LP as well. If you search for Stacey LP and Afterglow Rising, I'll probably pop up.
I will link all that down below in the description of this video. And also, my viewers and listeners, if you subscribe to my newsletter, then you know that I have made two new announcements. But if you have not subscribed to my newsletter, I'll make them really quick. So, first announcement I want to make is a new series on the channel, the audiobook series, where I'll be narrating my own books, the first two, here on the channel every week. And second, I have now begun my beta read application for my fourth book that has already been finished, but it's not yet sent to my editor. And I don't want to give too much away, but if you've read The Gathering and you've read Amonist, the spinoff slash semi-sequel, then you kind of know what this next book is. So I will link that down below as well. Thank you all for joining us for the month of November. I cannot wait to share with you the other guests lined up for this month. And again, a huge thank you to Stacey, and we wish her all the best on her journey, as well as the release of her book, which comes out on the 15th. I had to remember the date, so make sure to check that out as well, and give her a follow and a review, because reviews help us authors. They grow our brand. So, Stacey, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. This has been so much fun.
You're welcome. And as always, viewers and listeners, make sure to like and subscribe. Comment down below what was your favorite part of the interview. And this is the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, wishing you all a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world.